The train departed Moscow at midnight, moving east into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the world. Dr. Anatoly Alexandrov sat in a first-class compartment that was paradoxically both luxurious and prison-like, the velvet curtains drawn tight, the door locked from the outside, his travel documents stamped with red ink that meant nothing to him but everything to the guards who had escorted him to the platform. It was August of 1949, and he was traveling to a place that did not exist, to work on a project that could not be discussed, for a state that demanded everything and explained nothing. Through the window he caught glimpses of the Soviet landscape rolling past in the pre-dawn darkness, villages where lights still burned in kitchen windows, forests that stretched to the horizon, and somewhere out there, hidden among the birch trees and the endless steppes, were the secret cities, the closed installations, the invisible empire within the empire where the future was being forged in laboratories and test sites that appeared on no maps and existed in no official records. The city he was traveling to bore the designation Arzamas 16, though its real name was Sarov, and to the outside world, to the peasants who lived in the surrounding countryside and the party officials and regional capitals, it simply did not exist. The entire area had been erased from maps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, patrolled by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. Inside this invisible perimeter, thousands of scientists and engineers and workers were constructing the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb, racing against time and against the Americans who had already demonstrated the terrible power of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Alexandrov had been recruited for his expertise in physics, plucked from his position at the Leningrad Physics Institute with no explanation beyond a terse order signed by Lavrenti Beria himself, the man who terrified even Stalin's inner circle, the architect of the Soviet nuclear program and the master of secrets so deep that knowing them could mean death. When the train finally stopped, hours later at a station that bore no name, Alexandrov was met by men in dark suits who checked his papers 3 times before allowing him to step onto the platform. The air smelled of pine and diesel and something else, something chemical and unfamiliar that he would later learn was the smell of uranium processing. They drove him through gates that opened and closed with mechanical precision, through checkpoints where guards examined documents and compared faces to photographs, through a landscape that seemed ordinary until you noticed the complete absence of road signs, the lack of any indication of where you were or where you were going. The city itself, when it finally appeared, was a strange hybrid of Soviet concrete and hasty construction, apartment blocks rising from mud, laboratories built with more care than the housing around them, a place where the priorities of the state were written in architecture and urban planning. The briefing took place in a windowless room deep inside the main laboratory complex, and it was there that Alexandrov learned what they were building and why. The man who conducted the briefing was Igor Kurchatov, the scientific director of the Soviet atomic bomb project, a physicist of genuine brilliance whose eyes carried the weight of knowledge that could incinerate cities. Kurchatov spoke for 3 hours without notes, explaining the physics of nuclear fission, the engineering challenges of weapons design, the political imperative that drove every decision. The Americans believe they have a monopoly on atomic weapons, Kurchatov said, his voice measured and precise. Stalin has ordered us to break that monopoly. We will succeed because failure is not an option that leads to continued existence. Every person in this city is here because the state has determined they possess skills essential to this mission. You will work until the work is complete. You will speak to no one outside this facility about what you do. You will live here, many of you will die here, and history may never know your names, but you will have saved the Soviet Union from nuclear blackmail and possibly from annihilation. The work consumed Alexandrov's life in ways he had not anticipated. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, time measured not by calendars but by progress toward the test that would prove whether their designs would work or whether years of effort would end in failure. The pressure was immense, made worse by the knowledge that the NKVD maintained files on everyone in the city, that mistakes could be interpreted as sabotage, that too many questions might suggest unreliability. And yet, despite the fear, despite the isolation, there was also something else. A sense of purpose, of contributing to something larger than oneself, of participating in the kind of scientific endeavor that comes along perhaps once in a generation. The scientists and engineers of Arzamas 16 were prisoners of a sort, but they were prisoners working on the cutting edge of human knowledge, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, creating a weapon that would reshape global politics and ensure that the Soviet Union could never be threatened with nuclear attack without the ability to respond in kind. The test took place on August 29, 1949, at a site in Kazakhstan that bore the designation Semipalatinsk 21, another invisible city, another place that existed only in classified documents and the memories of those who had been there. Alexandrov was not present for the detonation itself, But he heard the reports, read the data, saw the photographs of the mushroom cloud rising into the Central Asian sky. The device, codenamed First Lightning, had worked perfectly, yielding 22 kilotons, proving that Soviet science could match American achievement, that the nuclear monopoly was broken. Stalin was informed of the success while dining at his dacha, and he raised a glass of Georgian wine to toast Kurchatov and Beria and all the invisible workers who had made it possible. The Americans learned of the test through their atmospheric monitoring systems and were shocked that the Soviets had succeeded so quickly, shocked that their nuclear monopoly had lasted barely 4 years. What they did not know, what could not be known for decades, was that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project, that Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass and others had provided critical information that shortened the Soviet program by perhaps 2 years. The atomic bomb that leveled the nuclear playing field was built partly with Soviet brilliance and partly with stolen American secrets, a fact that would have profound implications for the Cold War that was just beginning. While the physicists of Alzheimer's 16 were building atomic weapons, another group of scientists was working in a different hidden city on a problem that was in some ways even more challenging. The facility was designated Sverdlovsk 19, though its real name was Latest, and here the task was to develop biological weapons, to weaponize diseases that had killed millions throughout history, to create stockpiles of anthrax and plague and smallpox that could be deployed against enemy populations if war came. The work was justified, at least officially, as defensive research, as necessary to understand biological threats that might be used against the Soviet Union. But the scale of the operation, the resources devoted to it, the elaborate delivery systems being developed, all suggested offensive capabilities, preparations for a kind of warfare that had been banned by international treaty but that the Soviet leadership believed might be necessary for survival in a world where capitalism and communism were locked in existential struggle. Dr. Yuri Ovchinnikov arrived at Sverdlovsk 19 in 1952, recruited from his position at the Institute of Biochemistry in Moscow, told only that his expertise in microbiology was needed for work of national importance. The reality of what he found there shocked him in ways that his training had not prepared him to handle. The laboratories were state-of-the-art, equipped with technology that most Soviet research institutions could only dream of possessing, but the research being conducted was the stuff of nightmares. Scientists in protective suits worked with pathogens so deadly that a single mistake, a torn glove, a failed seal, could mean death within days. The goal was to enhance these diseases, to make them more virulent, more resistant to treatment, easier to disseminate. Ovchinnikov's assignment was to work on anthrax, to develop strains that could survive in aerosol form, that could be loaded into bombs or missile warheads, that could be released over cities to kill millions. The moral weight of this work bore down on Ovchinnikov like physical pressure, made worse by the knowledge that questioning the program would be interpreted as disloyalty, that expressing doubts would result not in debate but in arrest. He had colleagues who had disappeared, transferred to other facilities or perhaps to something worse, their absence explained away with vague references to new assignments or health problems. The scientists of Sverdlovsk 19 worked in a state of constant moral compromise, telling themselves that they were defending their nation, that if they did not develop these weapons then enemies would, that their work might actually prevent biological warfare by ensuring mutual deterrence. These rationalizations were necessary for psychological survival, but they did not entirely dispel the nightmares, the dreams of cities consumed by plague, of responsibility for suffering beyond comprehension. The accident came in March of 1979, decades after Ovchinnikov had left the program, but it vindicated every fear he had harbored during his years at Sverdlovsk 19. An explosion at a military facility near the city of Sverdlovsk, the same city that gave the secret installation its designation, released a cloud of anthrax spores that drifted downwind across residential neighborhoods. 6 people died, though official reports claimed the deaths were caused by contaminated meat, a cover story that would not be definitively disproven until after the Soviet Union's collapse. The incident revealed that the biological weapons program had continued and expanded, that the Soviet Union maintained stockpiles of weaponized disease despite international treaties banning such weapons, that the secret cities were still operating, still researching, still preparing for a war that would make conventional conflict seem merciful by comparison. Far to the north, beyond the Arctic Circle where winter darkness lasted months and summer brought only pale light that never quite dispelled the cold, another category of secrets was being maintained in a city designated Murmansk 60, though sailors called it Zapadnaya Litsa. This was the home of the Northern Fleet submarine base, and more specifically, the home port for vessels that carried nuclear missiles, boats that could lurk beneath the polar ice cap and launch weapons that would reach American cities in 30 minutes. The submariners who served on these vessels lived a life that was equal parts boredom and terror, months underwater in steel tubes that creaked and groaned under the pressure of deep diving, breathing recycled air, eating food that came from cans, knowing that at any moment they might receive the order to launch, to turn their keys and begin the sequence that would end civilization. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zatev commanded one of these submarines, the K-19, a November-class ballistic missile submarine that sailors nicknamed Hiroshima because of its nuclear armament and Widowmaker because of its reputation for mechanical problems. In July of 1961, during exercises in the North Atlantic, the K-19's reactor cooling system failed, and within hours the submarine was facing a potential catastrophic meltdown that could have resulted in a nuclear explosion equivalent to a small atomic bomb. Zatev ordered his engineering crew to make repairs, knowing that this meant sending men into a compartment flooded with radiation so intense it would kill them, knowing that he was sentencing them to death to save the submarine and perhaps to prevent an international incident that could have triggered nuclear war. 8 men went into that hell, worked in shifts measured in minutes because exposure beyond that point meant certain death, and they successfully jury-rigged a cooling system that prevented disaster. All 8 would die within weeks from acute radiation sickness, and many more crew members would die in the following years from radiation-induced cancers. The Soviet government denied the incident for decades, claimed the submarine had experienced minor technical difficulties, gave the heroes of K-19 no public recognition because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging the failure, the danger, the reality that the nuclear deterrent they maintained was as dangerous to themselves as to any potential enemy. The archipelago of secret cities extended across the entire Soviet Union, from the Urals to Siberia to the Far East, each one designated with a number that replaced its name, each one dedicated to some aspect of the military-industrial complex that consumed a quarter of Soviet GDP and employed millions. There was Krasnoyarsk 26, where plutonium was produced in reactors built inside mountains, where the waste from decades of production leaked into the Yenisei River and contaminated water supplies for cities downstream. There was Tomsk 7, where nuclear weapons components were manufactured in facilities so dangerous that workers received extra food rations and preferential housing because the state understood they were being slowly poisoned by their labor. There was Kapustin Yar, the Soviet equivalent of Cape Canaveral, where missiles were tested and satellites were launched, where the space program that would eventually put Yuri Gagarin into orbit was developed in secrecy so complete that even other Soviet government agencies sometimes did not know what was happening there. The administrative apparatus required to maintain this invisible empire was itself massive and secret. The State Committee for Atomic Energy, known by its Russian acronym as Minsredmash, controlled not just the nuclear weapons program but also entire cities, power plants, research institutions, and industrial facilities spread across 11 time zones. It answered directly to the Politburo, operated with budgets that were classified even from most government officials, and wielded power that in some cases exceeded that of regional party secretaries. The chairman of Minsredmash in the 1970s was Yefim Slavsky, a man who had overseen the Soviet nuclear program since its inception, who had survived Stalin's purges and Khrushchev's reforms and Brezhnev's stagnation by being indispensable, by being the person who understood how all the pieces fit together, how to get things done in a system that was simultaneously highly centralized and chronically dysfunctional. Slavsky's power derived from knowledge and from the ability to operate in the shadows, to make decisions that affected millions without those millions ever knowing who had made them or why. He controlled the flow of fissile material, the allocation of resources to weapons programs, the careers of thousands of scientists and engineers. He could shut down a reactor or accelerate a weapons design or relocate entire facilities based on strategic considerations that he might explain to the General Secretary but to no one else. The Soviet nuclear arsenal, the deterrent that guaranteed mutual destruction and therefore, paradoxically, peace, existed because of men like Slavsky, bureaucrats who were neither evil nor good but rather servants of a system that valued secrecy and power above transparency and human welfare. The costs of maintaining this secret empire were not merely financial but human and environmental as well. Lake Karachay, near the Mayak nuclear facility in the Urals, became so contaminated with radioactive waste that standing on its shore for an hour would deliver a lethal dose of radiation. The Teka River, which flowed through villages where people had lived for centuries, was turned into a radioactive sore, and the residents downstream developed cancers at rates far above normal, their suffering explained away as genetic problems or poor diet or simple bad luck. The Polygon, the nuclear test site in Kazakhstan where the Soviet Union conducted 456 nuclear tests between 1949 and 1989, left a legacy of contamination that would persist for thousands of years, that would cause birth defects and cancers in populations living downwind, that would render vast areas uninhabitable for generations. The Soviet government documented these effects in classified medical studies, knew precisely what was happening to its own citizens, and chose to continue testing because the strategic benefits outweighed the human costs. at least in the calculus of Cold War thinking. The espionage operations that supported the secret programs were themselves masterpieces of deception and penetration. The NKVD, and later the KGB, ran agents throughout the West, recruited scientists and engineers who had access to classified information, exploited ideological sympathies and personal weaknesses to acquire secrets that would take years and billions of rubles to develop independently. The atomic spies who provided information on the Manhattan Project were only the most famous examples of a much larger operation. Soviet intelligence penetrated NATO headquarters, recruited agents inside the Pentagon, obtained technical specifications for American weapon systems, and in some cases acquired actual hardware that was reverse-engineered and incorporated into Soviet designs. The MiG-15 fighter, which shocked UN forces in Korea by proving superior to most American aircraft, incorporated a British jet engine that had been legally purchased and then illegally copied. The Tu-4 bomber was a Bolt 4-bolt copy of the American B-29, reverse-engineered from aircraft that had made emergency landings in Soviet territory during World War II. But the greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War may have been Operation Ryan, a program initiated in 1981 by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov based on a belief that the United States was preparing a first-strike nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. KGB stations throughout the West were ordered to watch for indicators of such preparation: blood bank inventories increasing, government officials evacuating cities, military communications patterns changing. The operation was based on paranoia and misunderstanding, but it reflected genuine Soviet fear that the Reagan administration's aggressive rhetoric and military buildup were preludes to war. In November of 1983, during a NATO command post exercise called Able Archer 83, Soviet leadership became convinced that the exercise was actually cover for a real attack, and the Soviet Union went to a higher state of nuclear alert than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war not through aggression but through miscalculation and mutual suspicion, through secret systems designed to ensure security but that instead created the conditions for catastrophic misunderstanding. The human toll of the secret empire extended beyond radiation exposure and industrial accidents to include the psychological damage inflicted on those who lived and worked in the closed cities. The scientist who could never discuss his work with his wife, who carried secrets that isolated him from normal human connection. The engineer who knew that the reactor he was building had design flaws but who could not speak openly about them because criticism of Soviet technology could be interpreted as political disloyalty. The worker who understood that his health was being sacrificed for production quotas but who had no recourse, no union to appeal to, no free press to expose the conditions, nothing but the choice between acceptance and the gulag. The closed cities were communities built on secrecy and sacrifice, places where the normal bonds of civil society were strained by the weight of classified information and the ever-present surveillance of the security organs. And yet, paradoxically, these cities also developed their own culture, their own sense of identity and purpose. The scientists and engineers who lived in Arzamas 16 or Chelyabinsk 70 or Krasnoyarsk 26 were part of an elite, recipients of privileges that ordinary Soviet citizens could only dream about. Better housing, access to special stores with Western goods, higher salaries, educational opportunities for their children. They lived behind the fences not just as prisoners but also as members of a privileged class, participants in projects that were shaping history, contributing to achievements that they genuinely believed were necessary for their nation's survival. This created a complex psychology, a mixture of pride and fear, of patriotism and resentment, of satisfaction at being trusted with important work and anger at being trapped in a system that allowed no exit and demanded total loyalty. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not end the secret cities but rather transformed them, leaving them in a strange limbo where their purpose had vanished but they continued to exist. The nuclear weapons were still there, still required maintenance and security, but the budgets that had sustained the closed cities evaporated almost overnight. Scientists who had been working on classified military projects found themselves unemployed or unpaid for months, their skills unmarketable in the new Russia, their knowledge making them security risks that the government continued to monitor even as it could no longer afford to employ them properly. Some of the closed cities tried to transition to civilian production, to use their advanced technical capabilities for peaceful purposes, but decades of military focus had left them ill-equipped for normal market competition. Others simply declined, their populations aging, their young people fleeing to Moscow or St. Petersburg in search of opportunity, their legacy the contamination they had created and the weapons they had built. The true history of the Soviet Union's secret programs, hidden cities, and classified operations remains incomplete even today, decades after the regime's collapse. Archives that were supposed to be opened remained sealed, documents were destroyed as the Soviet Union collapsed, participants died taking their knowledge with them, and the Russian government continues to classify much information about nuclear and biological weapons programs. What is known suggests an enterprise vast beyond comprehension, a parallel state within the state where the normal rules were suspended in pursuit of strategic objectives, where human rights and environmental protection and public health were subordinated to the imperatives of great power competition and ideological struggle. The scientists and engineers and workers who built this invisible empire believed, many of them sincerely, that they were defending their country, that their sacrifices were necessary, that the weapons and programs they created would prevent war rather than enable it. Whether that belief was justified, whether the costs were proportionate to the benefits, whether alternative paths existed that might have provided security without such terrible sacrifice, these are questions that historians will debate for generations. The physical remnants of the secret empire remain scattered across the former Soviet Union, monuments to ambition and fear and the terrible logic of nuclear deterrence. The closed cities are mostly open now, their names restored, their fences rusting, though access to their nuclear facilities remains restricted. The test sites are contaminated wastelands, marked with radiation warning signs but otherwise abandoned to wind and time. The submarines built in Severodvinsk and based in Zapadnaya Litsa mostly sit rusting at pier, their reactors slowly decaying, their missiles long since removed, waiting for dismantlement that may never come because the cost of safely disposing of nuclear-powered vessels is enormous and money is scarce. The biological weapons facilities at Sverdlovsk 19 and other locations were supposed to have been dismantled under international agreements, but concerns persist that research continues, that stockpiles remain, that the knowledge of how to weaponize disease was never fully relinquished because knowledge, once acquired, cannot be entirely forgotten. The legacy of the Soviet Union's hidden secrets extends beyond physical sites and residual contamination to include the precedents set and the lessons learned about what states can accomplish when they mobilize vast resources in secrecy, when they prioritize strategic objectives over all other considerations, when they treat their own citizens as resources to be expended in pursuit of geopolitical goals. The Manhattan Project demonstrated that democratic societies could also build atomic weapons, but the Soviet nuclear program demonstrated something different. That a totalitarian state could match and in some ways exceed democratic achievement through centralized control, through willingness to accept costs that democratic societies would reject, through exploitation of espionage and intelligence operations that took advantage of the openness of Western societies. This lesson was not lost on other authoritarian regimes, on leaders who looked at the Soviet model and saw a path to great power status, to strategic parity with the United States, to the ability to resist American pressure and pursue independent policies regardless of Western preferences. The men and women who lived through the era of the secret cities, who worked in the laboratories and factories and test sites, who built the weapons and reactors and delivery systems that defined the Cold War, are mostly gone now, taking their memories and their secrets with them. Those who remain are old, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, their stories often untold because who would believe them, because the security classifications that bound them for decades still carry psychological weight, because the events they witnessed were so extraordinary that recounting them sounds like fiction rather than history. But their legacy endures in the weapons that still exist, in the contamination that will persist for millennia, in the geopolitical structures that were shaped by the programs they created, in the understanding that human beings, given sufficient motivation and resources and freedom from moral constraint, are capable of creating marvels and horrors in equal measure, often simultaneously, often in the same facilities, often by the same hands.